at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And I'd like to start by thanking Taina, Kate, Clara, De Pablo, and the other people who played instrumental roles in putting the exhibit together and organizing this truly fabulous symposium. As I just said, the topic of this panel is gender in 1898. Although gender is often taken to refer to women in particular, it also refers to the analysis of men and masculinity and to the social and cultural systems that ascribe normative roles and convey different rights to women and men. It also connects to the study of sexuality. Paying attention to gender, as we will see, is thus essential to our understanding of two themes explored in the exhibit: individual experiences and systems of power. With that in mind, it is now my pleasure to introduce the speakers in the order in which they will present. Leading off is Tessa Winkelmann, who was recently promoted to Associate Professor of History at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. She is the author of Dangerous Intercourse, Gender and Interracial Relations in the American Colonial Philippines, 1898 to 1946, published in Cornell University Press's U.S. in the World series, which she completed the book with fellowships from the Ford and Fulbright Foundations. She is currently at work on her second project, tentatively titled How to Rebrand Empire, Gender and Modernity in the Post-War Philippines. At UNLV, she teaches courses on Asian American history, U.S. and the world, and gender and women's studies. Our second presenter, Laura Prieto, is a scholar in residence at the Center for Women's Health and Human Rights at Suffolk University. She was the inaugural Alumni Chair in Public Humanities and Professor of History at Simmons University. Her publications include At Home in the Studio, The Professionalization of American Women Artists, the anthology Crossings and Encounters, Race, Gender, and Sexualities in the Atlantic World, and an essay on Clemencia Lopez and the Politics of Anti-Imperialism. She is currently writing a book about women's suffrage movements across U.S. empire before and after the 19th Amendment. She also co-directs the Mary Eliza Project, making publicly available the records and stories of over 50,000 women who registered to vote in Boston in 1920. Kristin Taitano Delisle is Associate Professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota, where she teaches classes in critical indigenous studies, Native women's histories, museum studies, and public history. Delisle published her book, Placental Politics, Chamorro Women, White Womanhood, and Indigeneity under U.S. Colonialism in Guam in 2022, and her current research examines national parks in Micronesia as contested heritage sites. Delisle is a former Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellow and has had articles published in American Quarterly, Pacific Studies, and Amerasia. And our final presenter, Laura Wexler, is the Charles H. Farnham Professor of American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. She chaired the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department from 2003 to 2007. Wexler is also co-chair of the Yale Women's Faculty Forum. Her book, Tender Violence, Domestic Visions in an Age of U.S. Imperialism, won her the acclaimed Joan Kelly Memorial Prize of the American Historical Association for the best book in women's history. In sum, we have an all-star cast today that will approach our topic from a variety of angles. And finally, before we launch into the papers, I wish to remind our audiences that some of the presentations in this panel contain images and text published at the turn of the 20th century that project racist stereotypes onto the people from the lands seized by the United States in 1898, among others. Although these images and texts are offensive, we think it's important to critically engage with them in this academic forum. So without further ado, Tessa Winkelmann.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to be here and also very excited that the Smithsonian is engaging in 1898 and its aftermath. So thank you. "You have an island as beautiful as your women." That was soon-to-be President of the United States, William Howard Taft, speaking to a delegation of Filipino representatives in 1901. His speech, a part of a larger commission tour around the Philippines to showcase American benevolence and to try to win Filipino goodwill. His appraisal of Filipino women and the suggestion of interracial attraction was intended to give the appearance of social equality, but behind closed doors, many in his entourage believed in Filipino inferiority and disapproved of interracial relationships. Filipinos, too, used the idea of interracial relations to couch their approval or disapproval of American imperialism. At one commission dinner, prominent Filipino intellectual Pardo de Tavera stated, quote, "We found that Americans were not slow in making the acquaintance of our women. What was more, they did not smile only on the pretty ones, as was the wont of that class which formerly set up first claim to women's smiles in this country." And there he's talking about Spain. He was on the one hand doing the same thing that Taft was doing, but he was also reminding Americans with his comparison to the Spanish Empire that he understood them as the newest in a lineage of colonial occupiers. Interracial intercourse, both the real and imagined, were deployed to shape the outcomes of the occupation. At the same time of Taft and de Tavera's comments, a bloody war of conquest was being waged by Americans against Filipinos in an attempt to subdue nationalist aspirations for independence. And so began the romance that is the United States and the Philippine colonial history, a relationship wherein professions of positive intentions and the suggestion of social and sexual attraction thinly veiled exploitative and militaristic designs on the islands. In my book, I describe interracial intercourse as encompassing a range of sociosexual relations, from the short-term and the economic, like within the sexual economy, to the long-term and the formal, such as marriage, right? Such intercourse informed everything in the colonial Philippines, from how the built environment was organized to how politics and diplomacy were structured. So to put it simply, US empire could not have taken the shape it did without these relations. Dubbed dangerous intercourse in the Surgeon General's 1899 sanitation pamphlets distributed to the troops bound for the islands, relationships between Americans and Filipinos occurred almost immediately upon the arrival of the first troops. And you see in much of the military record how ubiquitous these relationships were and how supposedly dangerous they were for the bodily integrity of US soldiers. Indeed, American colonialists at the turn of the century were largely responsible for crafting the dangerous ideas about Filipinas and sexuality that continue to be at the center of how people today understand Filipino women and Asian American women more generally. But looking beyond what Americans thought, at the heart of my research is also, I want to understand why colonized peoples would form these types of relationships with imperialists. Right? And I found that to make sense of the various archival fragments where women's voices dwell, I needed to think about their stories as a part of a tapestry of women's intellectual history. That is, when the Filipina, indigenous, Moro, and other women in the Philippines engaged in interracial relationships, much of the time they were not operating solely or at all within intimate frameworks, but within logical, strategic, and intellectual ones. They, much more than the new American colonizers, for example, knew what living under empire meant. They had been living under it for 300 years already. Right? They understood the dangers of interracial intercourse, but also the potential benefits. And fittingly, the relationships I explore frame these stories as a part of the intellectual history of women and how they strategically navigated the shifting imperial terrain. So the two snippets I'm presenting here both present and highlight the specific knowledge that women carried with them across the archipelago, as well as how the colonial state created and sustained ideas of dangerous intercourse relating to Filipino women. In the first example, I look at the voluminous military records concerning prohibition and soldier health. And what I found was not just an ignorance, but really a willful ignorance in American understandings of local women's lives outside of the fabricated, really fabricated, and all-consuming world of prostitution, which was the primary lens through which the colonial state understood Filipinas. In December of 1900, prohibitionists and moralists in the United States succeeded in passing the anti-canteen bill, stipulating that the military could no longer provision troops with beer and spirits within the garrisons. And this was a huge win for prohibitionists that predated the 18th Amendment. And because it was about the military, it was by extension about 1898, because all the troops were abroad, right? In the reports, American officers go on and on about the Filipina women who lured drunk Americans into sexual immorality now that the soldiers are forced to go off base to find their alcohol. Bringing back beer, they argued, was the prophylactic that could save soldiers from the spectral Filipina woman and syphilis. But the details in these reports that, as I note, are willfully ignored, point to a very different social world for local women. While the officers always tried to steer the reader back to the ubiquitous dangerous woman as a way to make a case for bringing back beer, the actual data they collected where real women who existed appear and aren't just this kind of presumed presence of the prostitute, right, shows that Filipina women made up a large part of the entrepreneurial class that was now operating saloons, canteens, and market stalls catering to soldiers. Many of the women listed in these reports were shop owners or vendors prior to the occupation, and they likely saw the American canteen bill as a chance to capitalize on the thirsty US soldiers cut off from their Pabst. Because women were so effective at selling liquor, they also essentially helped weaken military effectiveness by getting so many soldiers drunk that they often slept off their hangovers outside of the barracks. Cases of drunken, disorderly conduct and failure to report increased around the islands. And I got my sense of the social world of women through descriptions of marketplaces, as well as this 1867 watercolor by Jose Lozano. Women of all social classes capitalized on the thirstiness of US soldiers, from modest street vendors who set up stalls in marketplaces to wealthy society women who ran sari-sari stores from the bottom floors of their homes. For some women like Filomena Rubio, it would not be the last time she made smart decisions to cater to the new economic trends brought by Americans. Rubio was a wealthy sugar doña from Cebu who had to diversify her plantation when the US imposed new sugar tariffs on the Philippines. In a different economy, in the northern Cordilleras, an Ifugao woman named Dulimay engaged in a relationship with an American. Upon his departure from the town, she asked him to buy her a house. For him, this socio-sexual relationship was one that signified that he was a progressive anti-racist. He very willfully failed to really grapple with women's lives and desires, even when the women were very clear and the local conditions were also very transparent. Dulimay was part of a community where it was not uncommon for local women to provide sexual companionship to foreigners in exchange for goods and status. In fact, an influential woman in her community, Lingayu Gambuk Bayer, who was the daughter of a local Ifugao leader, was married to an American anthropologist who was very well positioned within the colonial administration. And the material benefits of Lingayu's marriage were very visible to the larger community. Though the American did buy Dulimay a house, he refused to acknowledge the transactional nature of their relationship, instead understanding the house as a gift out of his own kindness that he gives. This exchange highlights the different expectations and understandings of sociosexual arrangements under the US occupation. For him, the relationship was a test of his racial transcendence, but for Dulimay, race was actually probably one of the biggest factors influencing her decision to spend time with him, because she understood the realities of the new colonial order. In my second case study on colonial courts, it demonstrates how in civil cases involving interracial families, Filipinos were always framed as eligible members of American families. Despite the years of US pontification about Filipinos as liminal family members, such as orphans, dependent wards, little brown brothers and sisters, and as I point out in my work, romantic consort. These cases show how, like in the military records, Americans understood Filipinas and interracial relationships primarily through the lens of deviance and prostitution. Filipinas and mestizo children who became embroiled in legal battles often found themselves there because others, often their erstwhile white in-laws, rejected their legitimacy, from the legitimacy of their marriages to the rights to their custody over their own children, to their legitimacy as members of the US body politic. Even though trial outcomes often favored Filipinas and their kids, white plaintiffs framed them as deviants and therefore illegible claimants of Americanness and its material benefits. In 1923, Maria Bencosta fought back against these characterizations. She filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in a lower court in Cavite, a city just southwest of Manila, for the custody of her mixed-race American mestiza daughter. Ina Bencosta, the young girl at the center of the trial, was living with an American man named P.C. Dew and his wife. Dew was not her father, at least he didn't claim to be so. Her father, Jack Hamilton, was a shipkeeper for the US Navy and was convalescing in Baguio and had left Ina in Dew's care. Since Hamilton's paternity could not be verified, the court awarded Maria, the only undisputed parent, custody. But several months later, Bencosta faced the onslaught again, not by Hamilton, who had since died, but by Dew, who claimed that Bencosta was an unfit mother and prostitute, and who claimed this before the Supreme Court of the Philippines. Dew presented a letter from Ina's father to the court, which conveyed the desire that Ina be turned over to the Society for Protection of American Mestizos, an orphanage. So he would rather make his daughter a ward of the colonial state than have her be with her mother. The court was open to entertaining ideas of Bencosta's sexual deviance, as Dew had asked for more time to gather evidence about her sexual impropriety, but they ultimately decided that the key evidence they needed was Hamilton's proof of paternity. But since he had died and couldn't be deposed, the Supreme Court again found for Bencosta. P.C. Dew's intense investment in this case over a girl that he claimed was not his daughter speaks not only to the depths of the American belief in Filipino sexual deviance, but also to the ease with which they could rely on that trope to access socio-legal protections and privileges unavailable to their so-called wards. Despite this, and despite knowing that courts would subject them to accusations of sexual immorality, women understood that going to court could give them legal rights to what they knew was theirs. Bencosta's decision to file for a writ of habeas corpus, for example, a type of petition typically reserved for unlawful imprisonment, highlights how she understood her own rights to guardianship over her daughter. In her estimation, Ina was being unlawfully detained by Dew. The cases like Maria's are numerous. In 1916, the Philippine Supreme Court heard a case where a white American claimant sought to invalidate the will of her father, who had died in the Philippines, and he left most of his wealth to his Filipino family and not to her. In 1939, a white American man petitioned a Manila court to invalidate the marriage of his deceased brother to a Moro woman, who was the main beneficiary, on the grounds that his home state of Kentucky had anti-miscegenation laws forbidding marriage between whites and members of the, quote, colored races. In both cases, the erstwhile in-laws relied on gendered ideas of Filipino unfitness. But also in both cases, the Filipino families prevailed. By turning an eye to the purposeful abjection of women's narratives and perspectives, we can begin to understand how they navigated the occupation with their unique and specific knowledge of colonialism and of what day-to-day empire actually looked like. The women of the Philippines made rational intellectual decisions based on their deep, deep knowledge of how empires worked, what interracial marriages could mean, and what an influx of new people meant for local economies. And yet, it is the dangerous ideas about Filipino sexuality created by colonialists at the turn of the century that persist and continue to impact the lives of Filipinas in the Philippines and the diaspora today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Prieto, and I want to add my thanks before I start to the curators and organizers of this fantastic exhibit and symposium, also the many scholars and artists who have gathered here to share their perspectives, and thank you to the audience for your interest and your curiosity about 1898. As any gender historian knows, ideals of womanhood and manhood underwent a striking upheaval in the decade of the 1890s. In the US, some describe it as the era of the new woman, others as a time of crisis in masculinity. In truth, these two were interlinked. If men felt their privilege, authority, and identity threatened in this generation, it was the new woman casting her shadow upon them. In the 19th century, ideal womanhood had been focused on home and family. The new women of the 1890s increasingly demanded and gained access to advanced education and the professions. These new women were mostly middle and upper class white women, but the ideals sometimes crossed the color line. Popular culture celebrated new women's indulgence in pleasure seeking, not just on the golf course, but in movie theaters, amusement parks, department stores, and other kinds of entertainments. They pursued athletics and rode bicycles, straight into masculine terrain. Whether striding down city streets in their kid boots or adjusting their cravats before entering a college classroom, new women laid claim to men's province of the public sphere. Some even dared to lobby for the right to vote. If the new woman was going to invade male territory, would men have to take women's place and be relegated to childminders and domestic workers? To preserve their prerogatives, men would have to become more masculine, more virile, fearless, and martial. As turn of the 20th century novelist Elizabeth Stuart Phelps wrote, "A new kind of woman demands a new kind of man." This bold new woman and proportionately bolder new man were both evident on all fronts in 1898. They're not often thought of in the context of the overseas empire that the US amassed in that same era, even though war and colonial government created challenges and opportunities for them. The new masculine and feminine types reverberate in the icons and allegories of 1898, as we've been seeing today. In those who forged and fought against US empire, they crossed back and forth over battle lines and borders. How then did gender, new and traditional ideas about gender, shape the US's visions and revisions of empire? And how did the US empire shape gender in turn? Certainly, ideas about race were central to imperialism and colonialism, perceptions of indigenous people as not only profoundly different, but inferior, uncivilized, and possibly unassimilable. Yet gender also mattered greatly to how Americans managed and measured their colonial subjects' readiness for self-rule. Now, the splendid little war has an especially insistent masculinity about it. Manly authority and self-possession permeate the portraits of its statesmen and military heroes. I think that's very much apparent upstairs and epitomized, of course, by Teddy Roosevelt. His glory in the War of 1898 was not just the stuff of legend, but the culmination of his own self-making. A nearsighted, sickly boy who loved dime novel adventure stories, then a political candidate much mocked for his dandyism. TR had gone west to ranch, ride, rope, and transform himself. He returned tough and barrel-chested to revive his career in public office. By the start of the war with Spain, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a post he left in order to gather the first US volunteer cavalry unit. Roosevelt called their battle in the San Juan Hills of Puerto Rico the great day of my life. The Rough Riders and their commander became media darlings and icons of the new masculinity. And Teddy Roosevelt went on to champion what he called the strenuous life as a cure for the dangers of modernity. Without needing to struggle physically to survive, men like himself would grow weak in body, overly intellectual, debilitated by nervous disease. The fertility rates of educated white men and women were already declining. The only recourse for this gender crisis was to embrace difficult challenges, to seek out glory, to strive after great things, unafraid of warfare or childbirth. Meanwhile, the struggle for political autonomy by colonial subjects had a great deal to do with proving their masculinity to their colonial tutors. Filipino nationalists like Jose Rizal strove to look modern and civilized in the eyes of the world, so they made their cosmopolitanism and European education as visible as possible. Even their choice of clothing was a strategy. While mestiza women in the Ilustrado class wore butterfly sleeves and ternos, fashion specific to Filipino culture, elite Filipino men and other colonized men wore the universal uniform of sober, respectable, self-controlled manhood. They wore the dark-colored business suit, and that's also apparent in the galleries upstairs. Independista men hoped to gain American colonizers' respect and prove their capability for self-government, so they dressed for the job. The martial masculinity of the 1890s was not supposed to condone brutish aggression, but rather a noble manhood. The ideal man had dominion over his own strength and power, like a knight in service to the public good. American hawks thus anticipated and rationalized the War of 1898 through tales of chivalry and narratives of rescue. Popular culture often represented Cuba and sometimes Puerto Rico as a damsel in distress, the Philippines, Hawaii, and Guam more often as defenseless infants in need of protection, of adoption into a civilized family. These stories of valor and the white man's burden disguised the violence of war and colonization. President William McKinley presented the United States' possession of new territories in 1898 in just this way, as an act of protection and friendship for the natives, quote unquote, not an act of conquest or an invasion, but a, quote, mission of benevolent assimilation, substituting the mild sway of justice and right for arbitrary rule. Invoking this moral framework of rescue, protection, and uplift inadvertently opened the way for American women to involve themselves in empire, women who had long been seen as the moral sex. A few quick examples, because our time is short. In political cartoons, Colombia was a goddess proclaiming freedom to the allegories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Academician Kenyon Cox represented Colombia with a protective arm around Cuba, her younger sister or ward on the cover of McClure's. And this is my student's favorite. Photographer George Prince imagined America hovering in the clouds above Havana, ready to tuck in the city with an American flag. They find this very threatening. Actually, I don't think it's meant to be, but of course it is. Now, female allegories are not women, and Colombia represented the nation. But if Colombia could be a protector, bringing maternal comfort in ways Uncle Sam did not, then new women might fashion themselves imperialist rescuers too. Prince's vision especially is reminiscent of manifest destiny, right? As inexorable, divinely ordained, sanitized progress, where women, white women, were the gentle tamers of the West, weren't they? And if in 1898 the US was to be the benevolent empire it fantasized itself, then white American women had to share the work of civilizing the US's new colonial subjects. American imperialists lauded white women's influence as essential, in fact, to overturn the Oriental and Latin domination of women by men. As teachers, nurses, and missionaries, especially American women, mainland women, offered Caribbean and Pacific women what they assumed were more enlightened models of emancipated womanhood. The tutelage of colonized women became the special burden of white American women. Although still sometimes controversial and threatening at home, new women thus became part of the modern gender ideals that the US encouraged colonized women to follow. As you may imagine, the gender politics of this imperialism left colonized women in a problematic position. American colonialism looked to women as barometers of indigenous progress. In the case of Hawaii and the Philippines, some US rhetoric even suggested that women would be ready for democracy before their husbands and fathers. More an indictment of indigenous manhood than support for colonized women's suffrage. Meanwhile, anti-colonialist men assigned women to be the bearers of culture, the embodiment of the nation and keepers of native traditions, even in the clothing that they wore. And here you see the potent symbol of the terno with its distinctive sleeves, a fashion statement that had proud associations with Filipino nationalism and independence. Colonized women who aspired to the mobility, education, and other freedoms of the new woman were caught between these two insufficient contexts. Anti-colonialist men valued women most as real and symbolic mothers, but American imperialists were not emancipators either. It is telling that colonized women had to struggle for their right to vote even after ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The American colonial system took the idea of tutelage literally. Teachers were central to the building and management of American empire, and the US dramatically expanded local systems of public education in its territories. And we see in wartime political cartoons and other popular representations how often American teachers appear as women, but women in actuality were a much smaller proportion of the colonial teaching force than they were on the mainland. They were about 1/4 women of the teaching force in places like the colonial Philippines. Teaching demonstrates how even while it made use of new women, US empire remained an arena for new men, that 75% of teachers. But I want to turn to nursing for the rest of my time here as a better example of how for American new women, US empire brought the prospect of professional advancement. It gave them the chance to wield authority over brown women and men and the mission to remake colonized women in their own image. The very notion of women as military nurses was highly controversial at the start of the War of 1898. The US Army accepted women as contract nurses only after Surgeon General George Sternberg realized that the toll of disease in the war against Spain would quickly overwhelm the few male nurses already enlisted. So on May 10th, 1898, the first group of American women nurses signed contracts and departed for military bases. They were recruited by physician Anita Newcomb McGee, who vetted their professional as well as personal credentials. The process intended to guarantee the competence, experience, and good character of all these pioneering women, all of whom were white at first. But in July, the Surgeon General engaged clubwoman Namahioki Sockham Curtis to recruit more contract nurses for military service, including urgently Black women like herself. And this is because there was a belief that people of African descent had naturally higher resistance to tropical diseases, and they needed nurses who were immune to yellow fever in particular to serve in Cuba near the front, as well as in domestic hospitals. On her mission through Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina, Curtis personally registered 32 of the 80 Black women who ended up serving as contract nurses during the war. And nursing in Cuba offered these Black women a prospect of escaping the racial segregation, discrimination, and violence that typified late 19th century United States. Contemporary African Americans often regarded Cuba as a racial paradise, even though race had its own complicated history there that we'll learn about in the keynote. In the end, though, the Black nurses' experience mirrored the increased racism that accompanied US occupation of Cuba after the war and other colonized places. Almost all the Black nurse veterans found their Army contracts annulled by September 1898, often with no reason given or a rationale that the individual was just undesirable, and that's a quote from many of their papers. One of these Black nurses, Minerva Turnbull, contracted typhoid fever while she served. 5 days after her contract was annulled, she died en route home aboard the train at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Nurses' exemplary service during the war cemented their professional identity and actually enabled American nurses to gain a permanent place in the US military. In 1901, the Spanish-American War nurse veterans successfully lobbied for the establishment of an Army Nurse Corps as an integrated part of the US Armed Forces. And civilian nurses successfully built on their war service too. For example, in the building of nursing schools, hospital training schools like this one in Matanzas, Cuba, headed by Eugene Hibbard, who then went on to become Inspector General of all the nurses in Cuba and inaugurated a system of instructive visiting nurses. As in other imperial possessions like Puerto Rico, white middle-class Cuban women were the ones considered eligible for these opportunities, not poor women of African descent. Yet it took a while to convince these desirable classes of women and their families to adopt a type of work nursing that they had previously regarded as unrespectable. By the 1910s, Cuban nurses engaged in a wide range of projects from social work and child welfare to tuberculosis prevention. A further reward for being good pupils was the chance for these white Cuban women to become imperialists themselves, spreading the model of modern nursing further. Maria Aguirre Ariantes, for instance, helped export the Cuban nursing curriculum to the US-occupied Canal Zone. In this way, nursing and other professions as well spread among women alongside and through empire, sometimes even exceeding the bounds of race and class. Much as the US replicated the mainland's racial barriers, it also opened new possibilities. The University of the Philippines, for instance, established by the US colonial government, admitted women when Filipino women had had no access to higher education before. The government and private institutions developed pensionado and pensionada programs to bring promising students to the US to study, including some women. Gender and empire is thus a complicated story, a complicated legacy of 1898, in which some colonized women and men accepted the gradualist meritocratic conditions that the US mandated, while other colonized women and men chafed at expectations of assimilation and allegiance to the US when what they wanted was sovereignty and independence. So while we should not ignore the barriers, inequities, and exclusions imposed on colonized women, we must also take note that colonized women succeeded in becoming nurses and teachers, club women and anthropologists, suffragists and physicians, like Honoria Acosta Sison, who earned her medical degree in the US and returned to her nation to become a surgeon, a professor of obstetrics, a researcher and writer, an inventor of obstetrical instruments. The new women of 1898 weren't only bicycling across the mainland. They were also across US empire, where women like Acosta seized for themselves the role of the new woman as much as possible on their own terms. These are the stories going forward that we need to continue recovering and sharing. Thank you.
I want to start by extending a dankon na sadus masi to the organizers for inviting me. And I think I might go ahead and read off my phone rather than my laptop because I think it's going to cover my face. Can you? Oh. Earlier this year, Chamorro scholar, educator, and former Guåhan delegate to Congress, Robert Underwood, in his reflection of 125 years under America, described the events on the morning of June 20th, 1898, as a tragic comic opera. Underwood refers here to when the U.S. naval Captain Henry Glass sailed on the USS Charleston into Opera Harbor with commands to take the island, while Spanish officials were unaware that the United States and Spain were at war. For Underwood, what's missing in this whole enterprise and interpretation was how did the Chamorros feel about this? What of the governed? As a way of answering this question, he proceeds to tell the story of his grandmother, Taitano Underwood, who describes the Americans as crude. That in the early days of American colonial period,
in the early days of the American colonial period, in the wake of 1898, in the wake of the USS Charleston, they would go around banging on doors and shouting obscenities, not all of which were understood. And what Chamorros were hearing were American men running around. What they thought they were saying when they were yelling "woman," they were actually they thought that the Chamorros were they thought the Americans were saying "umang," which in Chamorro means hermit crab. And so they were like, "What's up with this, right?" Why would men go around the capital city of Hoganson screaming for hermit crabs? Part tongue-in-cheek, he remarks that Taitano Underwood ended up marrying an American, his grandfather, and so not all Americans must have been crude and bad. But despite this, the gendered violence in the wake of the USS Charleston, in the wake of following the ship and following the flag, that violence should not be lost in Underwood's anecdote. For my presentation today, I want to offer a different narrative for rethinking 1898, for rethinking in the wake of 1898, by way of colonial photography, and in particular, looking at some of the photography of American Navy wife Helen Longyear Paul, who was stationed in Guåhan between 1917 and 1919 with her husband, Lieutenant Commander Carol Paul, who worked for the Navy as a civil engineer. Paul was a teacher at the normal school, and she was also a photographer in search of the picturesque. And this is something that I look at in my book, Placental Politics. And I do this as a way of taking stock of the terms of Indigenous gender and sexuality, and the multiple levels of violence of U.S. Empire's civilizing project under the Navy, which included public education, public works, and public health. Of course, I'm going to be spending some more time on public education. But what I'd really like to do differently today, so this is new for me, and I want to try this, is to offer a different visual narrative of the image taken by Helen Paul here, as a way of highlighting the multiple levels of gendered violence, of benevolent assimilation, but more importantly, as a way of displacing conventional narratives of 1898. In offering this new read, I'll draw shortly on the work of the prominent Chamorro educator, Agatha Johnston, whose historical work as a teacher, like that of, whose work as a teacher, like that of the Chamorro midwives, who I also talk about in the book, The Patera, came under naval surveillance in the early 1900s. Real heavy surveillance very shortly after the Americans arrived. That material, the work of the Patera and Chamorro teachers who were recruited by the Navy, for me, furnishes the materiality for Indigenous women who continue, for a history, but also a politics and an Indigenous future of Indigenous women who continue to steward Indigenous lands and bodies and communities amid the forces of U.S. colonialism. In this iteration of Paul's picturesque, of how the aesthetically pleasing was writ on the body, two Chamorro school children, Sus, short for Jesus, and Dolores appear innocent and solemn, dressed in white. One might surmise from the boy's half smile a general sense of native contentment. What stands out in this photo is the contrast, the apertures of brown, faces and appendages, amid the bleached and bleaching effects of the contents and composition of the photograph, the clothing, the wall, the paved asphalt, and the objects the children are holding. Thanks to the caption, one learns that the boy is making a basket and the girl is making lace. One also learns that they are at school and are taught courses and trades along a gendered division of labor. The Navy implemented this curriculum to help Chamorro children become industrious citizens, and this was part of the Navy's efforts to turn the island into a cash-based economy. But the caption also reveals what the visual does not. That in addition to inculcating Chamorro children in handicraft and vocational skills, such as basket weaving and lace making, the U.S. Navy also taught the 3 R's. And though we might get from the caption a sense of the tensions between what colonial authorities desired for Chamorros, a good balance between vocational skills and an American education, and what Chamorro children themselves presumably wanted, to make lace more than learning to read, write, and do math, neither the visual nor the caption gives any inkling of the subjugation and violence of the presumably benevolent and benign gift of U.S. colonial education under the Navy. Hiding behind the photograph and the text are the austere reality and lived experience of Chamorro children who were not only prohibited from speaking the Chamorro language in the classroom and forced to speak English, but they were punished and fined for doing so. Instead, we are given a sentimental treatment of Native contentment and what Laura Wexler describes as a solution to a clash of forces that we must learn to see in the work of turn of the 20th century white women photographers. As Wexler reminds us, these solutions or denials and acts of tender violence developed, and I'm quoting here, not as a matter of conscious policy, but as a matter of gender, that is, as a matter of course. Theirs, women photographers, colonial, their cultural productions, was a natural way, of seeing that did not imagine itself as misrepresenting. In his study of education in Guåhan, Underwood has argued that with the onset of U.S. colonialism, Chamorro lives were interrupted by a harsh school system whose main agenda was to modernize young Chamorros and turn them into local and patriotic American wards. American schools, major agents in the assimilation to the American way of life and in the decline of the Chamorro language and culture, focused on 4 subjects, and those were English, health and hygiene, citizenship, and training for life, or life on the farm. The Navy's measure of success was based not on how American one was, but how un-Chamorro one had become. And I want to come back to this when I talk about Agatha Johnston. In Guåhan, under the U.S. Navy, modernizing meant Americanizing, which meant socializing Chamorros to become loyal and patriotic wards, so they would in turn self-exhibit loyalty and patriotism through activities such as pre-war health parades, Christmas pageants, industrial fairs, and post-war liberation commemorations. Within this militarized landscape of paternalism and education, Chamorros performed what Black feminist scholar Saidiya Hartman elsewhere describes as the terror, but also resistance in the scenes of subjection. Looking at racial subjugation during slavery and its aftermath in its wake, Hartman describes these scenes as quotidian forms of jollity and simulated gratification in the making of Black identity. Comparable situations would obtain in Chamorro routinized subjections and performances of daily calisthenic drills, flag rituals, and daily hygiene inspections. So I want to share, just show real quickly, share some of the other images that I think really convey these scenes of subjection in Chamorro contexts. And this is another image by Helen Paul that I analyze in the book. In the interest of time, I won't be able to, analyze it further because I want to move on to Agatha Johnston's material. But suffice it to say, this is one of the really good examples of that gendered violence in Guåhan. Talking about Chamorro women who are traded as wives. And here's another image. One of the Navy's projects was public health. So this image looks real serene. So there's another story here to tell in terms of the obfuscation of power of the lay midwives and the training of younger nurse-trained midwives. Again, while I'm interested in showing these multiple levels of violence under U.S. colonialism. I'm especially interested in demonstrating the way that Chamorros have negotiated the terms of U.S. naval colonialism. And I want to do this by manipulating Helen Paul's original photograph by way of triptych, a form of art and photography made up of 3 pieces or panels as a way of imparting narrative, creating sequence, movement, and think, especially Chamorro women's movements and mobility, by extension mobility, and by way of showing different elements of the same subject matter, the focus here, of course, being on Chamorro indigeneity, and as a way of disaggregating and displacing benevolent assimilation and what the Navy referred to in Guåhan as the long road to rehabilitation after so-called Spanish misrule. The exterior panels remind us of the gendered dimensions of U.S. colonial education. But what I found really intriguing when put into triptych was the center panel. The empty, not always empty, but perhaps maybe more appropriately, the vacated bench, the pupil bench. To me, this leaves room for further interpretation, perhaps symbolizing the muting of the colonial experience. In this sense, it serves as a powerful metaphor when we think about recurring images like this one, which many of you, I'm sure, have seen. So in the interest of time, I actually want to move to the stories, some of the stories of Tanagata Johnston to give a really good example. I think the story and the history of Tanagata Johnston really illustrates the way that Chamorro women negotiated the terms of U.S. colonialism in ways that speak to these earlier images of the gendered violence, but also thinking about these negotiations in more complex, dynamic, nuanced ways, and what the investments were for Chamorro women like Agata Johnston. In conventional historiography, Agata Johnston is known as being simply patriotic, a really good pupil of the Navy. She was born in 1892, is of the first cohort to actually to be subjected to the military's compulsory education. And so what I do, what I have begun to do is to look at her unpublished writings, which really begin to put a different spin on things. And what we get from her unpublished writings is ambivalence about the Navy. So she's categorized as a really good example of the assimilationist project, being a good pupil. She would move up, and so education for women like Tanagata, or we call her Tanagata back home as a sign of respect, but education for women like Agata was an opportunity for outward but also social mobility. Johnston she began to register ambivalence in what was unfolding. It was concern for the land and the people, and the United States military's post-war condemnation of more than 85,000 acres of land in Guåhan that proved to be a turning point for her, or just as importantly, a moment of critical pause. Johnston expressed ambivalence, at times disapproval, of the military's incessant and relentless bulldozing. Of the Halamtano, the jungle, and the Lansu, which is where she grew up. And a lot of the narratives about Tanagata's patriotism really don't highlight the fact that she grew up in a Lansu, which is another version of the Rancheria, but a smaller plot of land. And so she had these really deep connections to the Lansu. She referred to the ubiquitous bulldozer as the dolldozer, for the routine and banal way that it chugged over every landscape, how it, quote, pushed over acres of palms and shrubs and forests, half of the island in leveling for airstrips, hangars, machine shops, storage depots, living areas for 200,000 military personnel, and roads and highways to every section of the island, and how it was replacing the Focinos the Chamorro farming implement that worked the Taitano, the land, into food and social space for Chamorros. So I actually want to end here in saying, in looking at her unpublished writings, we begin to get, and in fact, what I argue in the book is that Tanagata Johnston was a pivotal figure in the construction of a new Chamorro womanhood, one that had to carefully negotiate the U.S. colonialism under the Navy, but one that it was for Tanagata, U.S. education under the Navy was also not about divesting one's culture, and it was a way of advancing Chamorros at a time when it was essentially naval tyranny for the first 50 years of U.S. naval rule up until 1950, before the Organic Act. So, we have to read that in more complex ways. I want to end with a couple of images that I think capture Tanagata. This is another image of Helen Paul of the Lansu working the land. The point here I want to make is that with the Patera, with Tanagata Johnston, these were women whose investments in U.S. colonialism were also about stewarding indigenous bodies, indigenous lands. I use the term placental politics as quite literally, it was what the midwives were doing. They were disobeying the Navy's orders to burn the placenta, but they continued to practice that because they believed that by burying the placenta, you were safeguarding the children out of harm's way. And I use that to talk figuratively about the work like Agata Johnston for stewarding Chamorro women and communities. And this work, to me, is what I call what I think is really important material for thinking about contemporary Chamorro women activists who are protesting the recent development, the military development that's happening in Guam, and the destruction of the environment and destruction of ancestral burial sites. Thank you.
Keep it quick. And I just want to remind you now, remind you at the end, the keynote is at 5 o'clock, so we'll have a little break before that. Thank you so much for these wonderful papers. It was really a delight to hear them, to see the images, and I so appreciate it. One of the things that they brought to mind is just basically what I love about the exhibit, right? Like how it goes beyond the perspectives of a handful of elite white men to be more multivocal and to represent, more individuals and perspectives in ways that I think, more accurately get at the complexity of the American people and people who found themselves caught up in webs of U.S. power, right? And your work seems to be very much part of that project. And I also love how you've managed to kind of navigate, the big, kind of stereotypes and allegories and structures and legal and political systems and ideologies on the one hand, but also like individuals as well, and also the struggle of being able to capture individual, perspectives and stories given the documentary evidence that is available to us. And I also love just what you're doing in terms of, denaturalizing, gender roles and thinking about the politics and power, dimensions of that, which is very much consistent with thinking about, critically U.S. power in the world. So to launch the discussion, I'll just throw a couple of questions out to the panelists. You can answer one or more if you'd like, and then hopefully, time for Q&A. So the first is just how the exhibit and the really remarkable array of visual materials it contains has affected your thinking about representations of the wars of 1898. And if you could add a caption or an image or a couple of images to the exhibit, what would you add and why, right? So that's question one if you want to engage with that. Question two is, can you reflect more on the challenges and payoffs of using visual materials in particular to illuminate your topic? And that question comes in part from what we were talking about at lunch with just how the exhibit skews towards representations of men, right? And so just, to think more for people who are working in women's history about visual materials and the challenges and payoffs. And then finally, your papers just made me think back on the day, like many years ago, 20 years ago, when I was picking my dissertation topic, and I had to argue, right, like really hard, like gender is relevant to the wars of 1898. There was so much resistance, and I feel like I fought that fight. So many other people have been fighting that fight. It's been going on for 20 years, and I don't know, like, how you make sense of that now, right? Like, are you still fighting that fight? Has that fight, when you are in your classrooms, dealing with public audiences in the academy, your sense of, how has the scholarship kind of made it out there? What are some of the challenges that remain and the stakes of that work? So, go for it.
Thank you for those really probing questions. For your question about what I would have liked to contribute or seen, there's something maybe I would have actually liked to hear, because there was and I don't have this in my book, but I'm just kind of sitting on this material of all these Tin Pan Alley songs that were produced between 1898 and 1902. And so many of them were about this kind of interracial romance. And the Tin Pan Alley scene, a lot of it drew from the kind of traditional blackface minstrel American traditions, right? And in a lot of the cover art for the sheet music, you just see like one caricature that's just like replaced with a Filipino caricature, and it's like a whole new, brand new thing, right? And they were so prolific in bringing these songs about empire into American homes via sheet music, and so many of them were about, this kind of wistful interracial romance. That would have been interesting to, like, if there was a way to have like a phonograph or like a piano or something, and speaking to this idea of it wasn't all masculine, right? If we look at the exhibit upstairs, it's definitely gendered because it's super masculine, right? But for me, I get the sense more of how race and racism played a role in 1898 in Empire versus how ideas of effeminateness and gender also played a role, and how those things are inextricable. So that kind of softness and listening to it would have been an interesting thing.
Okay, so when you take the show on the road, we need a soundtrack.
Yeah, and we could add some Mele by Queen Liliuokalani to the soundtrack. That could be a long soundtrack. A couple quick answers to your rich questions, Kristin, and maybe we can continue this into reception later on too. One about the exhibit, I think of gender as a way of seeing, as a lens or a perspective. So, like, there isn't an exhibit ever that does not have, isn't about gender and doesn't have gender in it. I think it's more what we bring to it. So as you just said, Tessa, like, there are these striking images of masculinity upstairs. You don't necessarily perceive them as such. So I think it's more about the labels and having guided tours and, like, asking questions about what we're seeing than what we're seeing, because I think it's there. It's in how we see it. And just a quick note about the archive. Your question about visual materials. One of the challenges for me working as a historian, not an art historian, but the kind of people and things that I want to write about, the stories, some of them are kind of over-documented visually, and those tend towards the stereotypes, perhaps. And then others don't have any visuals. So I mentioned Minerva Turnbull, the Black contract nurse who died 5 days after her contract was annulled. I have not seen an image of her anywhere. I haven't been able to find one. And so for me, it's in back and forth between people and ideas that there is surplus imagery about, and then ones that are really still quite invisible, literally invisible in the record that we have to piece together more. That's the challenge.
So I didn't get to finish all looking at the entire exhibit, but The one thing, one thing as I was walking around is where are the umang? I'm joking. That's the hermit crabs. where are the women? In other words, right? In some of the exhibits, and that's always a hard one when you think about material culture and archival material, and so sometimes you know that drives the exhibit. So that's a challenge, and I don't say that as a criticism, but I guess it's, you know, it really does raise the question about what we need to think about in terms of the kind of material to put on display, and should we be thinking less about authentic documents or you know, maybe a combination of that as well as oral histories. Again, I haven't looked at all of them, but just initial thoughts on what I saw today.
Yeah.
We're getting the sign that we only have a minute, but maybe what we could do is collect questions, you know, just to put them out there, and then if they're short, then we can have a 1-minute response, but then the coffee break will provide an opportunity then, you know, to follow up on the questions with the speakers. And their mics, as a reminder, in the aisles.
I'm happy to voice questions. I can't voice from all the way over there, though. Or you just go ahead and use your microphone. I did want to ask, you know, as someone who was looking for materials and not finding very much. Some of you know me as a women's historian, so it was very frustrating to try to address gender in this history. History of war is generally dictated by men, and that's why I have a problem with telling the United States history through war history, because inevitably it's prioritizing men. So when Taitano and I put this exhibition together, you know, we had a real, we were like in a sort of dilemma. But I did want to, I guess, for future conversations, I'm always curious about how historians who are spending all the time in the archives, you know, you have more time in the archives than I can afford myself as a public historian. What are your strategies? Like Tessa, I loved how you're saying you kind of piece together the ways in which women were experiencing the Philippines from looking at early market photographs and things like that. And I mean, it's like these little segments, right, of the ways in which you can piece together women's history when there's not a Clemencia Lopez out there for every woman, you know, and anyways, that's just one of my thoughts as I was listening to you and wanting to ask you. But let's go to his question. We can talk later.
First of all, thank you very much for wonderful talks that were very insightful. I want to basically piggyback on the very last comment that Professor Wexler made, that we actually don't really know what gender is and how to find it, and that's the challenge I'm encountering, and that I would like maybe your advice on, is because you're all presenting very vivid cases of moments where gender is so explicitly there, right? Of women wearing pants, riding bicycles, of caricatures depicting Cuba as a woman or the Philippines as a child, etc. But how, I mean, gender isn't only there when it is explicitly addressed, but always implicitly. It's a logic that defines behavior. So how do you go about uncovering that in the things, not just that are said, but that are not said, in the way people behave rather than talk, in the words they use, in the words they omit? And, you know, this reading between the lines, because there's so much more to this logic than just the explicit contestation of certain norms that we see in documents, or when people use the word man or woman or whichever gendered word they want to use. But how do you find the implicit in gender?
Okay, are there any other questions? Will they ponder the implicit in gender? And if not, we'll have a response for that. I'll get the final word and we'll let you take a break. Okay, implicit in gender. Keywords.
We say anything, it's not implicit anymore.
So why don't we follow up on that in the break? But I just really quickly want to respond to Kate, because I think your exhibit counters your own point, right? Like if the history of war is just about military personnel who are paid for being military personnel, then historically it has been a male-skewed phenomenon. But your point is that civilian populations have been massively caught up and implicated and involved. And that in recent wars, often the majority of deaths have been female non-combatants, frankly. So that to think of war as a more societal and cultural experience, just, which is what your exhibit does, right?
Well,
There's so
thank
much
you
in the
for that.
exhibit that it's not just,
We just have to remember that we're limited to portraiture, and that is the media that we are. So that was my point, was that searching for this. Yes, the exhibit addresses obviously the beyond the men, but I think that for Taitano and I to find objects that were made, from life, from that time period, commenting about these conflicts of 1898, that was the challenge. Yeah. We really found almost, very few women portraits of women. There, and that's one of the flaws of portraiture. It was made really by and for elite men, mostly white. And so that's just one of the things we're up against.
I should have shown my final slide, which I didn't because of time, but it was the portrait of Clementia framed in her own family home. And I think one place where one can find this is in family photographs and family photograph albums, which it's beyond me why they are left almost fully untouched by the historians of all of these major events, because the presences and absences in the family album and how that is narrated by the album tells this history.
All right, so let's give everybody a final round of applause, and we'll be back here at 5.